I think we're going to kick this off to make sure we abide by your schedules too. And just let you know, feel free to get up and grab something to eat or drink. Don't worry about that as we proceed with our panel today. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm Erik Paulsen. I'm the chairman of the Institute for Gene Therapies, and I'm excited to help convene our conversation with our esteemed panel today. As we all know, in today's world, the science of gene therapies is outpacing the healthcare policy frameworks that are needed to support it. And IGT is focused on helping close that gap on behalf of patients. We welcome the FDA's recent new draft guidance on leveraging prior knowledge for gene therapy development, which is a very practical, science-driven step toward getting promising treatments to patients faster without compromising rigor. And that guidance, along with the plausible mechanism framework and new next-generation sequencing safety standards, reflects the kind of coherent, modernized regulatory thinking that this field needs. The message from FDA is clear: reduce redundant barriers, accelerate access, and keep pace with the science. So today we're here because Congress is being asked to do something that is moving in the opposite direction. Foreign referencing pricing, proposals such as MFN, most favored nation, however well-intentioned on cost, would also introduce a new set of barriers that could deny the very patients that gene therapies were designed to save. Roughly 70% of rare diseases begin in childhood. They're progressive, they're often devastating, and the window of intervention is very narrow. Nearly half of children with special health care needs are covered by Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program. For about 1/3, those programs are really their only source of coverage. Medicaid policy is functionally access policy for all of these kids. So Congress, the good news is Congress has already worked to improve this via multiple best price policies that IGT supports, but MFN would layer a rebate obligation on top of that structure, potentially exceeding 100% of a drug's price, and make value-based gene therapy contracts financially shaky overnight. And we don't have to speculate about what that world looks like. Europe has already shown us. EMA-approved therapies have been withdrawn from markets, the pipeline is now thin, and pricing uncertainty has driven investment away. Importing European price benchmarks through MFN would import Europe's gene therapy access failures right alongside them. And the children in this country who are counting on a life-changing therapy would pay that price. The panelists that we'll get to hear from today, patient advocates, health economists, and policy experts, will help bring reality into sharper focus. So today we're joined by, in no particular order, Amir Bilal, who is the Vice President for Programs and Policy at the Caregiver Action Network. We have John Feore, IGT's own Director of Health Policy and Advocacy. We've got Christina Hartman, who is the head of U.S. Government Affairs in the Washington, D.C. office for Orchard Therapeutics. And we have John O'Brien, who was the president and CEO of the National Pharmaceutical Council, joining us. He's a former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation and Health Policy. So we're going to get right into our discussion if we can, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions from the audience as well if you'd like. So we'll kick it off maybe with you, Mr. O'Brien. I'll just ask you, as I had mentioned earlier, about half of all children with special health care needs rely on Medicaid or CHIP as their primary or only source of coverage. How should Congress be thinking about the downstream consequences of MFN pricing on pediatric rare disease patients specifically?
Excellent question. First, thank you for not just inviting me, but for convening these experts on this important topic. It's great to see so many people here. We were discussing earlier, I think about 70% of what I know I learned in rooms like this where box lunches were being served, so it's great to get to be on the other side of the microphone. When I look back on everything that's happened since I was a pharmacy student, I have to remark that we're living in a golden age of biomedical innovation, and the gene therapies that we're talking about today would have been considered science fiction to me when I was in pharmacy school. And we can't pay for today's treatments and tomorrow's cures with yesterday's reimbursement system. So as policymakers think about how to modernize the reimbursement for these kinds of therapies, I understand the temptation to look overseas. It is absolutely true that as a country, we pay more per capita for prescription medicines than any other country. It is also true that if you look at what we spend on prescription medicines as a proportion of total healthcare spending, we're probably like second last out of all of the industrialized nations. So it's really important to think about those kinds of comparisons and be mindful about the systems that we're comparing ourselves to, because setting U.S. prices by importing foreign price controls has the potential to do three things. I think the first is we're importing foreign values, and oftentimes their algorithms, if you will, for landing on a price incorporate assumptions or equations that don't respect the same preferences that U.S. patients do. So it's not just that we're importing a price or importing a methodology, we're importing a different set of values or patient preferences than we have in the United States. The second thing is, this is a risky, capital-intensive business, and importing those price controls has the potential to reduce our ability to invest and continue this golden age that we're seeing of not just gene therapies, but other durable treatments. And third, and most importantly, it has a real potential to hurt patient access in a couple of different ways. One, when you look at what's going on in some of those other countries, patients are forced to wait on average 3 years longer than patients in the United States for just conventional therapies. And when you start to talk about access to gene therapies, sometimes they don't get access to those treatments at all. But there's also impact beyond just the medicines that we have today. As we change the incentives for investing in tomorrow's cures, the message that we send to this risky capital-intensive industry has the potential to decrease the investment that flows into this new science. So from my perspective as a pharmacist or someone who's worked in policy for some time, discouraging investment in new treatments, specifically treatments for small populations, at a time where we're just getting our arms around the science that can help them, is sending the wrong message and doing the wrong thing to children and parents who are waiting for science to help.
So don't interrupt the golden age, right? The opportunities. So maybe I'll just follow up with this then. The multiple best price policy was hard-fought fix that was designed to ensure outcome-based, pay-over-time arrangements, make sure they're viable for high-cost gene therapies. So how would layering an MFN rebate structure on top of that reform that's already been done functionally undo it? And what does that mean for states that are trying to build more sustainable Medicaid coverage models?
The multiple best prices policy is important because, for many years, payers and states have basically said, hey, before we pay for these kinds of treatments, we really want to make sure that we're getting our money's worth and we're getting a return on investment. And before we outlay 6-7 figures on a medicine, we want to be certain that we're going to see the benefit. So industry and payers came up with this concept of a value-based arrangement, where if the medicine doesn't work, you get all or some of the money that was paid back. So that kind of gave payers, both public and private, a little more certainty wanting to invest in these kinds of treatments. As you get into the weeds of drug pricing policy and you've worked on any Medicaid issues, you understand that there's something called Medicaid Best Price. So if I give a private payer a warranty and say, if this medicine was not effective or didn't work in this kind of patient, I'll give you your money back, I'm essentially creating a $0 best price, which means that now the Medicaid program gets that medicine for free. So the multiple best prices policy that was created allowed manufacturers to be able to work with public and private payers in a way that makes sure that Medicaid still gets the best deal, and we could enter into these kinds of warranty-based arrangements. By layering on most favored nation rebates, it does two things. One is it compresses the range of negotiations or rebates or other incentives that can be used in a value-based arrangement to ultimately get to a system where we're paying for outcomes. But the second thing that it does is it has the potential for the discount or rebate to ultimately exceed 100% of the price of the drug, which then puts a manufacturer in a situation where you're saying, here's your treatment, and we're going to wrap a $100 bill around it for using it. And those kinds of unfortunate outcomes would make manufacturers kind of move backwards from what we've achieved in terms of developing a value-based payment policy. So while I recognize that the current generous model has a carve-out for the treatments that are available today via the cell and gene therapy access model, we don't have that certainty that future medicines would be subject to that same carve-out. So again, I think we should be encouraging, not discouraging, manufacturers of gene therapies and other forms of durable treatments to want to pursue value-based arrangements. And the way that MFN rebates would function would discourage participation in those types of arrangements.
Okay. Amira, maybe we'll jump to you. For many families that are affected by rare diseases, gene therapy represents more than a treatment. It may actually be the only opportunity to alter the course of a child's disease before irreversible damage occurs. We talked about the time component. How should policymakers weigh the human costs of policies like MFN that could delay or restrict or discourage access to these therapies for future patients? You have the patient perspective.
Yes, thank you for having me today. I believe that policymakers need to understand that we're not just talking about the price of the drug, we're talking about the price of the machinery that brings the drug into the access point for the participant or for the patient. So to disrupt the investments that are being made means that you're actually disrupting the investments that are made for the advocacy and for increasing the awareness and the education to patients and providers of the availability of the gene therapy and what it would really mean to participate in the clinical trials, what the risks and the responsibilities are to all the stakeholders. And that is something that I think while it does have a very definitive cost, and that cost can be high, the lens that we apply is the human cost, and what does it mean to ensure quality of life, if not life itself, for a particular patient. So we have to be very careful when things seem to be dissonant, the messaging carried by an agency versus by a member of Congress versus by or by a business. Sometimes that messaging, the devil resides in the details of the nuances of how the messages get out regarding the market and regarding the viability of participating in these trials and activities. But I think that when you look at the emotional costs and you look at the actual time investment and you look at the fact that caregivers, be they parents or other members of the family who are assisting with providing the care and the care support structure to ultimately these children who are participating in gene therapy, we invest millions of dollars, hundreds, if not thousands of hours in making sure that those people are in their best state of mind and are in the best position to provide the support that makes accessing the clinical trials or the gene therapy treatments even viable, even something that a person, an actual person says, I will try this, I will invest my hope in this. So I deal in a space that talks about hope, that talks about inspiration, that talks about resilience. And I think the human cost cannot get lost as we develop words on paper, especially if those words on paper collide with other priorities or other interests that don't really put the patient first.
Well said. Christina, maybe we'll shift over to you. Europe, as we mentioned already, has run this experiment. EMA-approved therapies like Skysona and Zynteglo have been withdrawn, and the gene therapy pipeline remains thin. So what should U.S. policymakers take from Europe's experience, and how do we avoid importing those access failures right along European price benchmarks?
Yeah, Eric, this is what keeps me up at night. So, thank you, Amira, for everything you just said about caretakers, because I live that night and day. I have a child with an ultra-rare neurodevelopmental disorder, and the thing that keeps me coming back and showing up every day for the biotech sector is that hope that these medicines bring to families like mine. I'm now on my second gene therapy company. It is a very tough space to be in. I know, John, you were saying this is something that seemed like science fiction until very recently. Well, now it is real. We are still at the very beginning. There's a lot more advancement that needs to occur. There are so many diseases. About 95% of all human diseases don't have a single FDA-approved treatment. There's so much further that we need to go. And the place that is the incubator for all of this innovation is right here at home in America. My first gene therapy company did a lot of work. They actually ended up with 3 approved gene therapies, one for beta thalassemia, one for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, and one for sickle cell disease, a very large indication. Yet they ended up selling for pennies on the dollar to private equity, and there's a long story there. But before all of that happened, they actually pulled out of Europe entirely. They could not come to reimbursement terms for those gene therapies, and so Europe does not have access to them. That is not something that we want to see happen in America. Not only do we need access to therapies that we have right now, we need to provide the incentives to bring more to market. When I see these blasts that go out from different places of folks that are just focused on the price tags of high-cost therapies, there's never any context behind that. The reality is we only have a handful of these therapies presently available on the market. We also are not looking at the value that these therapies are providing, not just to society, to the families taking care of these patients, and to the patients themselves. We have the data, we've done the analysis, we've run the economics. We know that the value is there. At Orchard Therapeutics, we have that independent review from ICER that showed the value of the therapy that informed our pricing and everything else. It is only about 40 or 50 patients a year. It's incredible that we even have this therapy on the market. And there's a lot behind that, and we're still not at the finish line. And I want to see an environment in America where we are incentivizing bringing these therapies to market, not putting up more barriers to them. Because again, 95% of human disease does not have a single FDA-approved treatment. And when big companies are looking at what they should invest in, what assets they should bring on board, they're looking at profitability. These high-cost gene therapies are not the most profitable assets for any business. That's a challenge. So we need to find ways to incentivize the development of these therapies, especially for rare pediatrics.
So Christina, you shared both professionally and personally sort of the impact that this field has directly had with you. Gene therapies for rare pediatric diseases serve some of the very smallest populations imaginable, and you just mentioned that. If MFN pricing makes those markets economically unworkable, what happens to the next generation of curative therapies that even haven't crossed the finish line? I mean, who bears that cost ultimately?
Yeah, the patients will bear it. People like my daughter, who she wants to have the ability to speak. She wants to have the ability to, drink from an open cup rather than a sippy cup. The ability not to have to use diapers at almost 10 years of age. And that's just one small segment of the community of human disease that needs help. But we live it every day. And if we don't find a way to incentivize, in particular, these rare pediatric gene therapies or rare pediatric treatments in general, that's who's going to be left behind. We'll see more treatments for obesity, for some of these large indications, but we're not going to see them for rare.
So, John, with IGT, we've talked about the dangers of MFN, but what are the policy alternatives? What are the outcome-based contracting and cell and gene therapy access models, the state Medicaid flexibilities that can actually address affordability concerns without dismantling all the innovation that is so important in those incentives that brought these therapies into existence in the first place?
Yeah, thank you. So there's really 2 broader umbrellas. One is financing. So how do you finance these? There's alternative payment arrangements. It can be a Netflix subscription model. It can be a warranty that you mentioned earlier. There's a whole host, reinsurance, stop loss. There's a bunch of different ways that you can help spread the costs over time for these therapies, since they are high cost, as we all admit. But it's a one-time cost for most of these therapies. So if you can figure out, and by figure out, there's not going to be one solution for the whole industry. Everything's going to be a little bit of trial by error at first, but manufacturers and payers, whether the payer is Medicaid, Medicare, private pay, self-insured employers, need to figure out what works for their particular group of enrollees, and it may vary by disease state, by therapy. So beyond payment, there is also the value-based contracting that we've already discussed about a little bit. So the cell and gene therapy access model is trying to figure out whether outcomes-based contracting works in the Medicaid space for sickle cell disease. There are 2 approved gene therapies for sickle cell disease. 35 states have signed up for this, showing a pretty strong appetite for testing outcomes-based contracting. But there can be different ways for value-based contracts to be designed based on looking at the FDA indication, the approved indication, and the label can help provide tools, benchmarks, milestones to judge whether a therapy has worked. And those are going to be negotiations between manufacturers and payers. But what we need is to have an all-of-the-above approach. As all the panelists have said, this industry is very nascent right now. The way to not have future cures and the next generation of diseases is to not allow them to operate, not allow patients and families to have access to these therapies. So an MFN is neither a financing mechanism or a value-based mechanism. It's a transfer of money from manufacturers to the federal government. It has nothing to do with innovation, other than harming innovation. It has nothing to do with patient access. It's frankly a transfer of money based on a price control in another region that is proven to be inadequate for gene therapies to even operate in, and advanced therapies to even operate in. So the focus of policymakers and all stakeholders, patients, manufacturers, payers, needs to be on how can we figure out a system for each gene therapy, for each advanced therapy that works for that particular therapy, that particular patient base, and then how can we learn from that to then apply it to other therapies. And at first, it's going to be challenging. It already is. But these are part of the challenges. The manufacturers have taken on this challenge of turning science fiction into science. And now we need an all-of-the-above approach to figure out what works best for more prevalent diseases like sickle cell, what works best for ultra-rare diseases, what works best for debilitating progressive diseases where we need an intervention right away. So all of the all-of-the-above approach is the best tool we have right now, and it needs to be fostered and not hindered.
Yeah, so there's not a one-size-fits-all at all, by any means. And by the way, MFN is the topic of the day, but foreign reference pricing is not a new concept, right? We saw the international price benchmark being talked in early versions of the Inflation Reduction Act. We saw the International Pricing Index, the IPI model, and now we have MFN. But they all carry essentially the same kind of risks for gene therapies. Maybe you can expand a little bit more. John and Christina, you were going to add something too. But
Oh, yeah, I was going to build on what you
go
were
ahead,
saying.
and
So,
then
our experience actually at both gene therapy companies has been that it's very challenging to ensure Medicaid patients receive the same timely access to therapies as their commercially insured counterparts. So at Orchard Therapeutics, we have a patient population that's about over 50% Medicaid, and then the rest are commercially insured. It's all pediatrics. None of these kids live long enough to hit Medicare age. They have metachromatic leukodystrophy, which is about 40 or 50 patients a year in the U.S. if we can find them in time, which is a whole other challenge, topic for another day. But when it comes to these value-based arrangements, we have worked very hard to make sure that those are available to states. We've been working with CMS. We've put that arrangement into their Medicaid drug rebate portal at their request. It's available to states. What we've found in practice is that states are reluctant to utilize that. They're more comfortable using their own rebate arrangements, things that they already have. Of course, we are happy to do whatever works best for the individual Medicaid program. But we have been working with CMS, working with leadership there. They're trying to figure out how can they support states, get some guidance out to them to try to make sure that they understand that they have these options and figure out what some of the barriers to uptake for these VBAs are. We also have been working a lot with Medicaid programs to try to understand, what are the barriers when it comes to things like having patients from out-of-state Medicaid programs. We only have 8 qualified treatment centers that can treat patients. So the vast majority of patients are coming from out of state to be treated. So each time you have a Medicaid patient, we're the first therapy, we're often the first gene therapy that they've ever worked on. We're having to create something essentially from nothing with that individual state. So it's a lot of work on the company. It ends up taking a lot longer for that Medicaid patient than it would for their commercially insured counterpart. The commercial payers are recognizing the value of these therapies, and there's really been no barriers there at all. They are covering it, they are moving quickly, treating these children. But with the Medicaid programs, it's a lot to figure out. I am given a lot of hope by the CMMI CGT demo for sickle cell, but that's a very large disorder with 2 competing products. What I think we're going to see more of are these gene therapies for ultra-rare disorders. Hopefully, we'll see more of them, but there is no competition. It's the only thing available. So how are we really going to make sure that companies have that incentive once they get through that FDA approval process to stay with it and actually bring that therapy to market? Because that's where a lot of them hit the barrier.
Yeah, and so the foreign pricing reference, however you want to define it, it simply is just a hindrance to innovation. And by hindrance, I should actually say it halts innovation. And we've seen that. We have a direct experience with 3 approved gene therapies. So maybe there wouldn't be a foreign reference price because their payment systems don't even allow for access. But that's what we need to focus on is access for today's patients and for tomorrow's patients, because the science is there, it's starting to get there, it's going to get better over time. What we need to focus on in this country is expanding access beyond 8 treatment facilities, beyond urban academic centers, into the communities, so that every American that might have a disease that could benefit from a gene therapy or cell therapy has that access. And so the way to do that is not by a blunt instrument of just slashing price or trying to reference a couple countries here or there that have a completely different system of values, to John's point. In the U.S., I like to think that the value of a gene therapy is far beyond, as Christina mentioned, it's a value for the patients, their families, society, young children that can actually grow old and be contributing. I mean, these are benefits that last potentially decades, not just in a 60-day, 90-day, or 365-day budget window.
And you specifically referenced the value component. So, Mara, I think you can share a little bit here. But, caregivers often spend years navigating these specialist visits, hospitalizations, progressive diseases, while they are waiting now for new scientific breakthroughs. So, from the caregiver perspective, what message does this send if policymakers are adopting pricing policies that may save money in the short term, but reduce incentives to develop the next generation of potentially curative therapies?
So let's think about what caregivers are really investing. So it's not just their years navigating these visits and these hospitalizations. It is their time. It is their own health. It's their financial resources that assist with room and board when you have to travel out of state, with food costs, with coverage for other family members. Families can have multiple children, and if you have a child that needs specialized health care, you also have to think about the coverage and the care of everyone else who relies on you, and that can fall unfairly or with a lack of parity on either parent, not both, because in the background, somebody is working, somebody is providing for just the survival of a unit. And as much as we gloss over that, that is real. There are going to be other policy conversations about affordability, about salary and wages, about industries that are growing or shrinking. And in the midst of all of this, you can find caregivers in every conversation. So that is important to understand. And what happens is caregiver resilience as well as patient resilience is depleted. The more that you put in front of a person to say, here's something that can help you, here's something that can save your life, but you have to jump over 12 ladders and 4 hoops, you deplete their energy to do so. And if what it really comes down to is that, if we only focus on the price tag, if we only focus on the short-term savings, and then the next follow-up question has to be for who? and for what reason. You have to think about that, because it's not just saving for saving's sake. That's not even the system that we're operating within. So who is benefiting from us cutting, right? Who benefits from the cut? Who benefits from the shrinking? Who benefits from the hoops and the ladders? But ultimately, what you're saying to those people is that the little guy, the person who has the least access to multiple resources, to options, they matter the least. That's what it says. No matter what words you put around it, that's what it feels like. That's how it is processed as information and as messaging, and that is harmful. And we only really operate like that because we continue to operate within a market system and a frame of understanding that intentionally and unintentionally reinforces that. So when you have a lack of equity between private payers and Medicaid payers in access to gene therapy, whether you meant to or you didn't mean to, that is the message that is received. So those of us who are focused on reducing these barriers and making sure that that there is alignment and a lack of dissonance between the messaging of agencies, of policymakers, of manufacturers, what we are trying to get to is a consistent message of you matter. Your life matters. Increasing the quality of life for these patients matter. So that is the cost.
Yeah, and you mentioned time specifically. Christina, rare disease families frequently do tell us that time is their most precious resource because many conditions are progressive and the treatment windows are limited. How might MFN pricing proposals affect the willingness then of manufacturers, investors, and researchers, you've alluded to this, but to pursue those new therapies for ultra rare conditions where patient populations are already extraordinarily small, really small?
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge that we have with these really rare disorders is it's not a big market. It's never going to be an asset that makes a lot of money compared to all these other options that companies have when they look at what they're going to invest in commercializing and bringing to market. So if you try to put in a reference price to something that's happening in Europe, which is an entirely different universe from what we have here in the United States. Not a place that I want to move to, right? I'm here in America. This is the center for innovation. This is where I think that my child who's profoundly disabled can have the best possible medical care, the best possible potential to create a treatment for her. This is the place to do it. If we want to be like Europe, we're not going to see these medicines coming into the pipeline and coming to market. I really think we need to shift the conversation from a focus on high-cost gene therapies and these price tags to the reality of what's the budgetary impact. Right now, it's negligible. We never saw the uptake that we anticipated with any of these gene therapies. And that's a problem for the entire field. And I don't know how that pans out. But that challenge of these small populations and the limited return is something that impacts all types of therapies for that rare disease sector. So we really need to focus on creating the incentives, making sure we continue to lead in terms of innovation, because that's the hope that keeps most of us parents coming back. You know, when I'm at home changing diapers on my 10-year-old, right, it can get rough. Those weekends can be very long. But the hope that I have that keeps me getting up every day is that maybe there will be something that will bring her to her best possible range, that will make her capable of speaking a few words and being able to communicate what she so desperately wants to. We have the potential to innovate, to advance. I've met so many of the patients who have received these gene therapies, and it's unbelievable. You would never know that they'd had sickle cell disease or metachromatic leukodystrophy. They're just like another person. I mean, it is science fiction come to life, but we need to be able to do that for all of these disorders that don't have treatments.
So you mentioned shifting the discussion on costs. So for John O'Brien, when policymakers discuss drug pricing, the conversation often always turns to costs in the healthcare system. What perspectives are we missing when we fail to consider the costs that are borne by the patients and the caregivers, including lost independence and caregiver burden and reduced quality of life, and the long-term medical expenses that ultimately result and may result when access to these innovative therapies are either denied or delayed?
Now, there's there's an important theme that I heard amidst all of the panelists up here, which to me is that prescription medicines and gene therapies and other durable treatments are a form of capital expenditure. It's an investment in better health. It's a better investment in long-lasting outcomes. It is not an operating expense, a recurring cost of business that's going to keep going. I wanted to be a sports broadcaster when I grew up. I became a pharmacist when my mom got sick, and I was fascinated by what was in that tablet and now today, vial or infusion that could not only help her get well and stay healthy, but ultimately have lower total cost of care. And my fear today is that getting the medicine approved, discovering the science and getting it through approval is almost the easy part. And I feel like policy risk is now becoming at least as important as scientific risk in determining whether a patient who's been waiting gets access to a new medicine. I've digested thousands of studies throughout my education and today that measure how prescription medicines not only offset medical costs, but lead to things like improvements in productivity or decreases in caregiver burden, or to put dollars and cents on it, you getting to go to work as opposed to having to be at home caring for someone. There is an economic cost to a purchaser who's paying for medicines. And I feel like that gets lost. So in 2019, our organization published some research in health affairs, sort of affectionately referred to as the Bang for the Buck series. Now, I'm not a fan of traditional cost effectiveness because it sometimes ignores things like productivity, caregiver burden, and other patient impacts. But we used it to prove a point. And what we saw is that, over the decade prior, spending on medical care, including prescription medicines for the most burdensome diseases in our society, actually created a net societal value. So it wasn't just the spending, it wasn't just the cost of the avoided care, it was a whole host of other savings. And that's why I get so frustrated when an organization like ICER, whose methods of health technology assessment I don't agree with because I think they leave a lot of important things on the cutting room floor. But when even they say a gene therapy is cost effective at a 7-figure price and payers aren't covering it, it does two things. It deprives patients of hope, and it sends a message to those scientists who want to put the capital behind and get involved in the risky business of developing a medicine, saying, like, even if you're successful and get this medicine through this FDA approval process, there's a chance that it's still not going to reach the patient because payers are viewing these treatments as you said, a cost in a 365-day premium underwriting cycle, as opposed to a long-term investment that's going to create health and health outcomes and ultimately either generate medical cost offsets or create productivity by allowing someone to live a longer life and work. So I get the focus on why policymakers want to do stuff on prescription medicines because they hear it from pollsters back home. And oftentimes the policies that are pursued are viewed on like little cuts into an industry that can handle it. But when you start to add up all of these little cuts, 340B, Inflation Reduction Act, Medicaid drug rebate program, commercial gross to net, et cetera, I fear that we're starting to hit an artery, right? Or we're running the risk of hitting an artery. And if we send that message to developers that we don't want this kind of science, it's just going to leave patients waiting. So that's why we believe that good policy begins with good evidence. If you're interested in learning more about this evidence, I'd encourage you to stay in touch and scan the QR code on the little half card on your chair. And if there's ever anything that we can do to help the science and the economics of it all make sense, we'd be happy to help.
Yeah, you did a good job of really drilling into the economics, which is a whole nother discussion about how we spend so much of our healthcare dollar on chronic care management, right? And gene therapies are a whole opportunity, right, to alleviate and save dollars in the healthcare system. But maybe John Feore, many parents of children with rare diseases, they're worrying not only about access to today's treatments, but whether the cures for tomorrow's patients will ever even be developed, right? We've talked about that today on the panel. But what should policymakers, the positives, know about the concerns that policies like MFN could make companies think twice about making that investment in the next breakthrough solution for a disease that currently have no treatment options?
Yeah, I mean, it's simple. We already have capital investors pulling out of gene therapy research and paring back their pipeline. And if you impose a very harsh, just financial cut to the existing therapies, the fear is that the pipeline will just disappear. And we don't want to do that. 95% of rare disease do not have a treatment, so we're not even anywhere close to where we should be or where we could be. So that's really like just the biggest concern. We need to be encouraging the science to continue to move forward. And I like your point, John, that somehow the policy has become the hard part here. So we, as stakeholders, need to keep pushing harder to make sure that the coverage and access follow the approval. And that's where we make sure that future generations can have access to these therapies. It wouldn't surprise me at some point down the line, what we learn from gene therapy, the science of it, can be applied to chronic conditions and other diseases, other cancers. But we won't know that if we hit the artery too soon.
So we're going to begin to wrap up, but we have some very unique and knowledgeable perspectives up here on the panel. So we're going to close with the question that all of you can just chime in on. What would you want lawmakers to understand about the connection between preserving innovation, sustaining and maintaining medical access, but also ensuring that the next generation of gene therapy is going to be actually reaching the patients who are waiting for that hope, Feel free to just chime in, and then we're going to wrap up.
So I'll start. I was trying to remember whose quote this was, and I am paraphrasing, but it basically says, "My efforts will plant trees whose shade I will never feel." And that seems to be the theme of this conversation. And I wish I could attribute the quote, but it's such a powerful quote because even the work that I do, I'm not looking for it to benefit me today or tomorrow. I'm looking for the work that I do, the conversations that I contribute to. I'm looking for the things that I put my energy to make it better for people like my great niece, who's only 8. I do not expect for her to have to confront or have to enter into the same conflicts that I have had to, much like my grandmother did not want those things for me. And I think that that is the theme of this conversation as far as how do we balance what it might mean to the actual patients and the families who are affected by access to gene therapy, and also understanding the very real circumstances and constraints of doing business in this environment. So the one thing that I think I would want lawmakers to know is that it's always worth it. As we celebrate 250 and pray for 250 more, it is always worth it to make the investment today is so that we are strong tomorrow. Like, that's what we're talking about. These are not pie in the sky ideas. Politic is about what is going to be painful for whom and when. So we need to decide that this is not where we want the pain to really manifest itself. There are other parts of our whole entire American framework that might be better, that might be more resilient to some of the cuts, some of the changes that we need to make. And it doesn't necessarily need to be this area to the disadvantage of children and families.
Amara, I love that. And, that makes me think about something that I often hear from folks, about rare. A lot of people in America seem to think that you can control everything, right? I mean, I know with my older daughter, who's a great student, great athlete, I always said, look, I'm a great parent. This is all me. And then Charlotte came along and I realized that you really have very little control over what's going to happen to your children. With Charlotte, her disorder is de novo. It just happens. It happens there in development at some point. There's a single point mutation. This is a lot of different genetic disorders. It's not inherited. It it just happens. It can be your child, it can be your grandchild. You won't be able to predict it. You can try to design a baby, but there's still going to be a variant that you may not have anticipated, a change on a gene that's critical for something, some kind of functionality, and it's going to change your entire life. So if we don't have the systems set up to take care of people, it's a problem. And if we don't offer them hope for some of these treatments, it's tough to keep going. But I can tell you one of the costs that I think we haven't even touched on, my daughter's still school age. So we talk about the cost to the medical system, but where I live, Montgomery County, Maryland, she's so profoundly disabled, they have referred her for residential care. It's $250,000 a year. That's another crisis that we haven't. This is another topic for another day. She's been rejected from 10 different institutions, even out of state. There's a national crisis. There's not enough places for these people to go. I am kept up almost every night wondering what happens to her when I'm no longer here, or if my husband's no longer here to care for her. That is literally what keeps me up every night. These kids with profound disabilities, they require assistance with all activities of daily living. It's not something that one human can really take care of. You can go down a very dark rabbit hole on Facebook and look at these families of people who are 80 years old caring for their 40-year-old profoundly disabled kids at home, wondering what's going to happen, if they die tomorrow. So that's what I would like lawmakers to really understand is we do need to look at the care that we need to provide to these patients, not just medical care. They need that adequate medical care, but they also need that day-to-day care, all the care that's required as we continue to pursue these cures, because that is the hope.
Yeah, and I'd simply say that incentives matter. My graduate students can quote the Congressional Budget Office, who conservatively says that only one of every 12 drug research programs that get started in a lab ultimately leads to a medicine that reaches a patient. And conservatively, the cost of developing that new medicine is somewhere between $1 to $3 billion. And despite that risk and despite that cost, we've created a system of incentives in this country that has allowed the United States to become the world's leader in biomedical innovation. And that's good for patients, and that's good for the economy. And as we start changing those incentives, unfortunately, the way capital markets work, as we heard from John, has the potential to decrease the investment. Now, our world leadership in biomedical innovation is not an inalienable right. And we're starting to see China start to go the other way and make decisions it's almost wanting to encourage that kind of development, while at the same time, we're contemplating policies here that would risk that leadership. So to me, I hope policymakers understand that incentives matter, and we need to be careful to not damage the world leadership position that we've created here, because it benefits patients and it benefits our economy.
I guess I'll just conclude with, in an era where we're all hyper-focused on preventive medicine, preventive care, gene therapy is the ultimate preventive medicine for genetic conditions.
Right. Well, we've wrapped up with the questions for the panel, but I do want to give some time for maybe the audience to ask a couple questions. So feel free to just raise your hand real quick, and then we'll have a chance to mingle afterwards. But raise your hand if you have a question for anyone on the panel. Just maybe identify yourself and where you're from. Anyone in particular? Looking around. Feel free. Don't be shy. Right here.
I'll ask one. Ron Bartek, President and co-founder of the Friedrich Detection Research Alliance. Wanted to ask John Feore a question. You indicated that so much of the funding that would be that would accrue to an MFN approach would be taking funds from development and putting into government coffers. Could you explain that? I'm not sure I get that.
Yeah, so as the MFN structure is currently designed, whether it's through the proposed rule or potential legislative text, the savings, so it's not, it's frankly savings. You're saying we're going to pay this less than what we already are. Right, and so the savings isn't going into some new program of providing wraparound services like travel and lodging and fertility treatments for patients to receive these. It's simply just going back into the general treasury or the Medicare Trust Fund or whoever it is. Yep.
Yeah, and the challenge for me on just the phrase most favored nation or international reference pricing is there's a couple different ways to look at it, right? What President Trump is currently talking about in some of the voluntary arrangements that he's worked with individual manufacturers to achieve is pointing out that other countries are paying less or not paying their fair share for our innovation. And the difference in pricing there is almost like a subsidy to foreign governments. And that's why you're hearing conversations about using trade authority to kind of get other countries to pay their fair share. But other people talk about international reference pricing in a way that sounds like the prices that are being paid outside of the US are the correct price. And in reality, what many of those other countries are doing is using health technology assessment, which is strongly based on judgment, and the devil's often in the details of the assumptions that they choose, as sort of a fig leaf for the price controls to try to justify the underpaying for our innovation. So I think this topic, unfortunately, is going to be with us for a while, and understanding the difference between some of the voluntary arrangements that we're hearing about today about getting other countries to pay their fair share to stop our subsidy versus assuming that other countries do it correctly and want to import their approach. There's a real profound difference. And even in some of the policies that CMS is talking about today, we've done some analysis of how other countries get to those prices. And what you start to see is that they use things down in the details of their assumptions that no U.S. patient or purchaser really would stand for. So this is the concept of where that money's going and how that math is done is really important.
And would you conclude, therefore, that their foreign patients are going untreated because of that mechanism, that they're not getting these viable treatments to their patients? Is that true?
I think the decreased access that we're seeing overseas is the result of countries pushing harder and harder to pay prices that just aren't sustainable to development.
Okay. So the companies go away, is Christina's point. Yeah.
Anybody else? Yes, please, just identify yourself. And
Max Bronstein from Aviva Strategies. I've been doing rare disease advocacy for a long time. I think every single one of you mentioned incentives and the importance of incentives. I'd love to hear you speak to the current set of incentives in terms of what's working, what could work better. Are there other novel incentives that Congress should be thinking about in order to make sure that we're not leaving patients behind, particularly those coming from small populations or ultra rare?
Can I start?
Please.
I love that question, Max. Thank you. So I started my career in the federal government at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And back then, we had this little program called BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And it was an incentive. Congress gave billions of dollars for us to develop countermeasures for chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear attacks, and for pandemics. And back then, it was influenza that we were worried about. A lot of that prep work really paved the way for COVID. Thank God we did it. But what is fascinating to me now is we were so worried about national security and pandemics. When you have a rare child, pandemics don't even matter anymore. I mean, I had no fear of COVID. I have the fear of living every day with a profoundly disabled child. Many parents have the fear every day that their child's life is going to end before they can bring a treatment forward for them. In terms of public health emergencies, rare families are living that every single day. So what I would like to see in terms of incentives is I would like to see the government incentivize companies to produce treatments for rare pediatric disease. Create a RARDA. Have incentives for companies that want to do development here in the United States. Have it for companies that want to manufacture here in the United States. There are a number of ways you could do it. Incentivize large companies to do development work in these ultra-rare disorders while they're commercializing those assets for more common disorders that are going to bring in the profitability that they need. So I would love to see the government put their money behind this the way we did for public health emergencies and infectious disease.
Yeah, and I'll add, as a recovering attorney, I would say there's a lot of legal incentives, like fraud and abuse laws, that should be eased in these cases, because a lot of organizations are looking at what they can't do, not what they need to do. And so if the legal framework aligned with what they need to do to expand access, that would be an incentive as well.
Yeah, and overall for me, without speaking any particular incentive, it's that we've built a really delicate ecosystem. And inviting an unknown organism into that ecosystem has the potential to disrupt that ecologic balance. So, the NIH provides funding for basic science research that often leads to understandings of mechanisms or targets. Pharmaceutical companies, through tech transfer, have the opportunity to partner with the NIH or universities that continue to do that research. And that looks like about 10% investment on the government side, about 90% investment on the private pharmaceutical investment side to actually bring those basic science discoveries to life. We have an agreement that says that Medicaid will cover prescription medicines for its vulnerable population, and manufacturers will give the best price to those states. And the introduction of the multiple best price policy was a way to be able to move forward to allow both the existence of value-based arrangements and this 36-year-old deal on the Medicaid drug rebate program. So when you start to introduce unknown organisms like most favored nation rebates on top of something like that without thinking about how they're all going to work together, that's the ecologic balance that I'm concerned about disrupting.
All right, we have time for one more. Please raise your hand or go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rachel with the Cure Starts Now, and a lot of the kids in our community have rare and terminal brain tumors, including diffuse syndrome like Paulsen glioma. And my question is, do you have a sense on how MFN pricing would affect investment in CAR-T therapy and other personalized cell therapies as opposed to traditional gene therapy?
I think there are some excellent examples of cell therapies approved since 2017 that had long wait times or still patients waiting in other countries because of the way that those governments acted using their health technology assessment framework. And again, that's the fear that I feel like many panelists shared is if you try to import that methodology to set prices that we've already seen have led to either patient wait times or the inability for patients to get access, it has the potential to do two things. One is has the potential to make U.S. patients wait, but if we're where most drugs are developed, if we change those incentives for the development of cell therapies, especially at a time when we're starting to see applications of cell therapies in chronic diseases and things that aren't so rare. I think I just look to the overseas experience to see the kinds of things I wouldn't want to happen here.
Yeah, and even in the GLOBE model proposed rules, CMS asked whether cell and gene therapies should be excluded. It's a tacit admission that they might need to be excluded. And then for orphan drugs, you have the IRA, which was passed by solely Democrats, and then the Trump tax cuts passed by solely Republicans, included and then expanded the orphan exclusion from IRA negotiation. Another acknowledgement that price controlling in these areas is probably not a smart idea.
Okay, you had a question, and then we're going to close up.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about...
Just identify yourself, please.
Yeah,
Yep.
sorry, Rainey Major, Senate Finance Committee. I'm wondering how you create a solution to addressing costs, if not MFN, Is it value-based contracts / outcomes? Is it HTA? Especially in these ultra-rare settings where there is a lack of data and a lack of like evidence and proof that, you know, the therapy might have the outcome that you're hoping for.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, for our therapy at Orchard Therapeutics for metachromatic leukodystrophy, I think people are often surprised to find out that we have 15 years of data. And the reason we have 15 years of data is it's such a rare disorder. It took so long to find the patients and do the clinical trial. So a lot of these therapies actually have probably more evidence than you'd be expecting. But I think the heart of what I've been hearing here is we really need to focus on strengthening some of these domestic incentives that we have, what we did with multiple best price, what we're doing with the value-based purchasing arrangements, outcome-based arrangements. Focus on that. We should not be looking at importing foreign prices or foreign policies to reduce incentives, particularly for ultra-rare disorders. I'm actually given a lot of hope looking at this room, and a lot of people here that you've shown up, you're interested in this. Hopefully you can come up with some of these creative solutions for how can we strengthen these incentives to produce more medicines here at home. I just wish we wouldn't spend so much time focusing on things we know won't work.
Yeah, and John mentioned some, there's a whole range of options that, range from sort of the subscription model to the pay over time model, different uses of reinsurance and stop loss, et cetera, that I think are worthy of investigation.
All right, with that, we're going to wrap up, and our panelists will be around if you'd like to mingle, but thank you for attending today, and also know that IGT is looking forward to being a resource to you in any way possible. Our staff are around too, and just raise your hand. Some of our team is around, and feel free to grab them if you like, and visit our website at gene-therapies.org, and thank you for coming today. And thank our panel, please.